I'm going to ask you not to put on a geopolitical hat, but put your normal hat on and talk to me about what this means for markets, regionally speaking.
Well, I think in terms of the North Korean news, it's quite positive. There's a more direct impact with regard to sentiment for places like Korea and Japan, who are perhaps more directly impacted by any sort of fallout with a disagreement with North Korea. So that's ultimately a positive thing. I will say, though, that the devil ultimately is always in the details. So what comes of any sort of meeting between Trump and the Koreans, and indeed any sort of agreement post that of how they would denuclearize or indeed support North Korea going forward, will have very clear implications for some of the underlying stocks. But that's still some way out in the future, and perhaps I would just strike a note of caution that we've been here before with regard to North Korea pushing the boundaries and then looking to negotiate before eventually trying to push the boundaries again. So I wouldn't get too carried away, but absolutely good news if it is sustained.
Well, these headlines eclipsing those that were about, 12 hours ago, thereabouts, concerning the signing of those tariffs on steel and aluminium. Don't forget that at the same time, while this is all going on, we have the possibility of a trade war looming. What's your take on that?
Well, generally our take on any sort of protectionist measures is that it's negative. In many cases it's anti-growth, and in all cases it's inflationary. So any sort of sparking of a trade war or round of protectionist measures that started in the US perhaps and moved to other countries as well would be negative overall for the global environment. And the big question, I suppose, that everyone is asking is whether or not President Trump is going to follow through on all what has been suggested, or whether this is a negotiating tactic, that actually there is going to be more moderate, perhaps, agreements eventually put in place. And certainly that's the way that the market has taken the news this morning, that places like Mexico and Canada would be exempted, as well as the opening up of potentially a room for negotiation with other partners as well. So I think the market has put a relatively positive spin on it, but the devil, once again, is in the details in terms of how we actually see this playing out. Because at the end of the day, President Trump is playing to two audiences. There is a domestic audience, and he's trying to appeal to his base, where perhaps you don't want to see too much giving up of ground. And in contrast, you have a wider audience in terms of the global partners and indeed many of the congressmen in the US who want to maintain open trade, globalization.